Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. I'm Kyler Cheatham, your host for our regional digital stratosphere Asia Pacific event today. We're so excited that you're joining us. We have a great lineup of our Asia Pacific and overall global leadership here today. So just a few logistics before we get to the good stuff. We do have our chat box right on the right-hand side of your screen. Throughout the event, we do monitor this. If you've been to any of our other events or engaged with us in any of our other marketing or promotional tactics before, we love to hear from our audience. So please feel free to put any questions or feedback in the chat. It's always nice to have a great dialogue going, and the speakers will answer them in real time. Also, if you could put where you're joining us from today, we love to see how globalized our audience is and get that diverse feedback when it comes to all of our content. So if you could, just to test that function, put where you're joining us from today in the chat box. This event will be available on demand following our recording today. So if you do want to share with any colleagues or you are joining after the fact, the event replay is just available via the link that we have here. So all you need to do is register, and then you'll be able to watch it and whenever you'd like to. So with that, I'm excited to welcome our first speaker, Eric Kimberling, CEO and founder of Third Stage. He oversees our global team, and as many of you know, is our main thought leader in the digital transformation space. So today he's going to take us through the power of executive alignment and how important that is to any sort of successful digital transformation. So Eric, welcome to Stratosphere APAC.
Hello, thanks, Kyler, and thank you everyone for joining today. I appreciate everyone dropping in the chat where they're joining from. It looks like a pretty diverse audience from all over the continent and the region of Asia Pacific, as well as even some people from Europe and United States as well. So I appreciate everyone joining here today. And really what we like about these events, if you've never been to a digital stratosphere before, is we love to share our industry knowledge and lessons from the field and experience with clients with our audience. And that's Digital Stratosphere is an event in which we do that. And this localized event focused on the Asia Pacific region is particularly exciting because we haven't typically done that in the past. So this is really an opportunity for us to gather the community of a specific region and really try to talk about topics and tailor the topics a bit for what is top of mind for you all here in the region. So really appreciate any feedback and chat and comments you have along the way, particularly as it relates to localized needs or localized challenges you might be facing with your transformation. So very excited to be here, and it's also it's kind of interesting and fun to have the event online with you all because I haven't been back to Asia Pacific since the pandemic. So this is sort of an interim way for me to connect with some of the audience in the absence of being there in person. So what I thought we'd do today is I'm going to share my screen very quickly. And it looks like I'm sharing my screen, although I bear with me one second. I'm having an issue here. Do you see my screen right now, Kyler?
Yeah, we do. So we see your full desktop. So if you are able to share just
okay, how's that? Does that look better?
Yep, that looks better.
Okay. All right.
And I'd just like to point out before we start, Eric, I think that we match. I think our 2 in the morning brains here in the US decided that we were going to wear, the same exact shirt. So
right, yeah,
a treat for everyone.
We did not plan that, even if it was even if I was wide awake for our morning. I don't think I would have thought I had to plan that way. So it's funny that worked out that way. So what I thought would be interesting for really to start the conversation, and like Kyler mentioned, we have a couple other speakers. We'll be having both Wayne Holtham and Dean Sam from our Third Stage Asia Pacific office speaking with you later today. Wayne is from Australia, in Queensland, Australia, and Dean is from Hong Kong, and they'll both be presenting here after me. But in the meantime, what I thought I'd do is to set the groundwork and the context for the conversation is to talk about the power of executive alignment and digital transformation, and talk about really what alignment is and how to get alignment. And this is something that is very important, especially if you're an organization that's operating across multiple geographies. So, throughout Asia Pacific and even outside of Asia Pacific, if you have multiple locations, just making sure you have that internal alignment is very important. But it's also just as important, maybe even more important, to make sure that your executive team is aligned and that they have a global clarity on what their digital transformation strategy is. And so that's really what I want to talk about today, is what is executive alignment and how do we get it as an organization. So we'll go ahead and dive in here. As Kyler mentioned, I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. I've been in the digital transformation space now for close to 25 years. A lot of my background is in process reengineering, software selection, change management. Actually started my career at one of the big four consulting firms. It was I think it was Big Five back when I was there, but now it's the Big Four. But I was at one of those firms to start my career, and really started Third Stage because I was wanting to create a company that was independent, technology agnostic, but also was focused on helping clients through digital transformations. And so that's really why I started the company. And I certainly have a particular affinity for organizations throughout the world and global organizations too. That's something that I've done a lot of throughout my career. And as I mentioned before, we have a team now that's based in Asia Pacific that helps us with our local projects there as well. And so one of the things that we look at when we're chatting with clients and working with clients is ensuring that we have clarity on what the roadmap is and how we're going to help clients reach their third stages of success. And much like a rocket launch, which is where the analogy for third stage came from, there are 3 stages to a rocket launch, and that's really much of how we view digital transformations. And so when you look at a rocket launch that has 3 stages, the first 2 stages are what get it up into space, and then the third stage, final launch, is sort of the boost that gets it up into its final height and speed in orbit. That's a lot like digital transformation, because transformations are constantly fighting gravity and inertia and trying to gather momentum and trying to change the status quo. And there's a lot of risk. It's fraught with risk, and most organizations fail to reach that third stage of success. And so really what our goal is and what our job is when we're working with clients and when we're having conversations like what we're having today with organizations throughout the world, is we're trying to figure out, how do we help this particular client reach that third stage of success? What is it that is going to align best with their strategy and their overall organizational needs? And that's really the challenge and the focus of helping clients reach that third stage of success. And so we as a company not only are named after that rocket launch analogy, but there's a few other things that are important about who we are as an organization and as a team. And certainly the 3 of us and the 4 of us that you hear speak today with you during this workshop are going to find that we're all 100% technology agnostic. So we're not affiliated with any software vendors. We don't sell software. We don't specialize in one type of technology or system or one vendor. Instead, we focus on ensuring that we help clients select and implement whatever sort of technology from whatever vendors might make the most sense for an organization. And the other thing about the company that makes us unique is that we do view these projects as business transformations more so than technical initiatives. The technology is certainly very important, but the even more important components of transformation are going to be things like the change management, the people side of the equation, the process management, process reengineering, as well as the overall program management and business goals and objectives. So those are some of the challenges that are some of the aspects of the company that are important to note. And in terms of understanding, before we get into executive alignment, one of the first things we need to understand is what exactly is digital transformation. And transformation means a lot of different things. There's a lot of different buzzwords out there in the marketplace, different types of technologies that can be deployed as part of a transformation. And so ensuring that we have that sort of focus on what type of technology it is we're trying to deploy is very important. So, for example, a lot of times organizations think that digital transformation must just mean ERP implementation. Some might think it's Internet of Things. Some might think it's CRM or human capital management or artificial intelligence, machine learning, Industry 4.0, manufacturing execution systems. There's a lot of different technologies out there, and it's easy to get caught in the trap of thinking that any one of those technologies is a sort of silver bullet to a transformation. And even more importantly, it's too common that we find that organizations tend to think that it's the technology itself that constitutes a digital transformation. But in reality, digital transformation is driven by whatever technology or technologies make the most sense for an organization. And it's also made up of, or should be comprised of, the people, the process, and the strategic alignment aspects of transformation. So it's really important for us first to understand what transformation means to our organizations. And I would say some of our more successful clients are the ones that are open-minded to really trying to view the technology landscape as a sort of a puzzle. There's a bunch of pieces to the puzzle out in the marketplace, and we need to figure out which pieces of the puzzle make the most sense for our organization and best align with our overall corporate goals and objectives and strategies. And that's what we want to talk about here today, is how do we get that further alignment and further clarity beyond just defining what digital transformation is. How do we define the different components of that as well? And please, as I'm going through the presentation, please feel free to drop in any questions or comments in the chat, and Kyler can certainly stop me at any point along the way, and we'll leave some time for questions at the end as well. But please don't be afraid to interrupt me or to drop questions in the chat, and we can get to those as we go here. So some of the top challenges that organizations face, and this is actually from our 2023 Digital Transformation Report, which we are releasing this week. It's something you can download off of our website. You can also download previous years' transformation reports. But one of the things we found in our research and our experience with clients throughout the world is that there are 5 common challenges that organizations struggle with. And it's usually not the technology itself that creates the biggest problems for clients. So in other words, it's usually not the software itself. It's usually not the configuration and the customization of the software, although there are challenges and risks with that. They typically aren't the biggest challenges that organizations face. Instead, what we often find, or what we more commonly find, is that organizations struggle with things like data migration. That's the number 5 most common challenge that project teams and organizations have stated after the fact. Clarity of business processes is next, in terms of making sure that there's clarity on what the business processes are going to be and what that future state is going to be. And then difficulty managing or addressing deficiencies with the system integrator. That's the number 3 most common thing that challenges struggle with, or that organizations struggle with. So ensuring that they aren't just completely outsourcing and passing the responsibility for the transformation over to the system integrator. That's a common challenge that organizations have. Number 2, which is probably arguably most important to today's conversation, is transformation misalignment with strategic objectives. So in other words, we have a transformation that maybe on paper looks fine, but that transformation is not aligned and does not support or does not enable the bigger picture strategic goals and objectives. And that's a big part of what we're going to talk about today, is how do we get that alignment? How do we create a framework, and how do we deploy a framework that allows us to gather that alignment, or to gain that clarity into what our strategic goals and objectives and what our digital strategy to support it might be. And then finally, the number 1 challenge that organizations face is organizational change management in the people part of the transformation. So I have yet to meet a client or an organization or a project team that tells me that the change management piece was easy, or that it was as planned, or that it was easier than they thought. I've yet to meet that client that says that. More often than not, 99.9% of the time, organizations find that change management is a lot harder than they think. And part of that begins with overall internal alignment, but there's a lot more to change management. But certainly what we talk about here today is going to be a key prerequisite to a effective change management strategy, is to make sure you have that alignment first, and then the other change management activities to support the change initiative will enable that as well. So one of the other challenges we see, and this is something else we outline in our 2023 digital transformation report, is that there are more often than not disruptions, operational disruptions to organizations that go through a digital transformation. More often than not, these are short-term operational disruptions, but too often they are longer-term disruptions. And what we find is that over time, we found that year over year, it's hovered right around the 50% mark. Just over 50% of organizations experience some sort of operational material disruption at the time they go live with new technologies as part of their digital transformation. And the significance of that is that it's not just these aren't just minor disruptions like any go live that you would expect, where people are a little bit confused or things slow down temporarily until people get used to the new systems and processes. Here we're talking about more massive or more material operational disruptions. Here's where we're talking about people not being able to ship products or not being able to close the books, not being able to provide timely financial results. These are fairly material operational disruptions that we're talking about here, and the impact of those disruptions to the organization oftentimes dwarf the initial cost of the implementation. So that's why it's very important to not just look at what your total cost of ownership is from a implementation perspective, in other words, from start of implementation through go live, but the cost after go live is extremely important to make sure you're managing or understanding what the impact might be, because a lot of times organizations make decisions that optimize the initial implementation cost, but they have such severe disruptions to their operations that the overall cost ends up being exponentially more than the initial implementation. And that can range anywhere from 50% to 3 times, plus 50% to plus 3 times or 300% what the initial implementation cost is. And so you really have to look at the overall big picture and the overall long-term total cost of ownership and value before making some of these decisions. And so the things that most strongly impact operational disruption and create some of these challenges that I mentioned is things related to business processes, change management, lack of internal alignment, and lack of time and effort spent during user acceptance and conference room pilots. Those are 4 of the biggest reasons why, or the 4 of the biggest variables that have the biggest impact on whether or not organizations experience this sort of operational disruption. So, these 4 challenges, these 4 areas that are so important to ensuring that you don't have these problems. These 4 areas are things that we'll be covering throughout today's workshop, through this week's or through today's digital Stratosphere event. So our goal here is to share with you some best practices to help mitigate some of these risks that are mentioned here. And then just as a quick side note, some of the services we provide to our clients, I didn't mention this in our introduction, but we provide a number of different services to help clients through the entire digital transformation journey. We help them with defining their digital strategy, to evaluating and selecting software, to the implementation, program management, quality assurance, as well as providing business process improvement, organizational change, and implementation readiness support. So our goal, and with most of our clients, we're helping them through their entire digital transformation life cycles. And we certainly provide a good amount of services in terms of helping project recoveries. So ensuring that we help get a client back on track or help them with their project reset to sort of right size or to get a project back on track. And we also help quite a bit with expert witnesses work. So our expert witness work as well, which is related to lawsuits and litigation as it relates to transformations. And we've been expert witnesses for clients throughout the world in their transformations. So we try to take the lessons from providing all these services to clients and sort of distill them in this workshop here today to help you get started on and help you continue with your digital transformation journeys. So we talk about it when we talk about executive alignment and that overall internal strategic alignment that we're trying to gain. It's first important to look at our overarching digital strategy. So understand what it is we're trying to accomplish, what it is we are today, and where we're headed in the future. And we typically do that in the context of 5 major work streams, supported by a 6th one focused on project quality assurance at the bottom. But when you look at these different work streams, these were sort of the beginning points or the focus areas that we need to start with to help get alignment amongst our executive team on what our digital strategy is as an organization. And again, as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, it is not a matter of simply picking a technology like an ERP system or a human capital or CRM system or even some modern artificial intelligence or machine learning technologies or RPA. It's not a matter of choosing a technology and using that as a silver bullet to implement to improve your business. It's not that simple. What organizations tend to do, at least the more successful ones, is they define an overarching digital strategy that aligns with and supports their overarching organizational strategies, goals, and objectives. And the ways they do that is they start to unpack their digital strategies and define their digital strategies in the context of these 5 major work streams that are focused on business process improvement. So looking at current state and migrating to future state. It's also focused on organizational change management, which is the people or the human side of change, beginning with an organizational assessment and diagnostic, and continuing with organizational impact and the overall change strategy to address organizational change. It's also enterprise applications. So looking at what technologies we have today and what technologies we could be using in the future, and not only just the technologies we could be using in the next 1 or 2 years, but how does that technology landscape potentially help us evolve and continue our journey in years to come? So it may be that we have a big picture digital strategy that entails a number of different enterprise applications, but we're not going to necessarily implement those all on day one. We're going to have a more phased or sequential approach to deploying some of those technologies. So that enterprise application space and understanding and aligning on what that means and how technology can support the organization is very important. And again, it's very important not to fall into the trap of thinking we'll just go to Microsoft or SAP or Oracle or whoever the software vendor is. We'll get their latest and greatest product and we'll just go ahead and implement that, and that will constitute our digital strategy. There's a lot more to it. There's a lot more options you have technologically, and some of these other work streams are even more important than the technology piece. In addition to enterprise apps, we're looking at solution architecture. So we need to understand how systems tie together internally, externally. Even if you're going with a single or a core set of technologies, you're likely going to have to integrate that technology with other legacy systems or regulatory systems, especially if you're operating in multiple countries within Asia Pacific. You're certainly going to have different regulatory regimes and requirements that are important to address, and that solution architecture is a way to tie together systems across the landscape. And then finally, business intelligence and analytics is another component that's important to look at. Understanding what those reporting requirements are and what that future state is going to be is very important as well. So the power of executive alignment is extremely important. So it's a main pillar to digital transformation success, as I mentioned before. And without that executive buy-in and alignment, it's very likely that any transformation project is going to fail, no matter how well it's executed, no matter how great the technology is, even no matter how well you might handle change management and process improvement and all the non-technical stuff that I mentioned before that's so important. Even if you do that stuff well, if you haven't addressed executive alignment and you don't have executive buy-in and alignment, the project's probably not going to succeed. And I can't even count the number of times that we've had either an expert witness litigation related project and or a project recovery or reset where we had to help a client to get a project back on track. I can't even tell you how many times it had so much to do with executive misalignment. And there's been times where we look at projects and say, you know what, with the backdrop that we have here, with the lack of internal alignment, it is probably impossible for that organization to succeed. It really is that difficult to lead and manage change if you don't have that clarity and clear vision and direction for your overall strategy. And if you don't have that executive buy-in, that's a significant challenge as well. And this whole dynamic trickles down to managers, and it's something that should involve managers as we get alignment. That's something that can start to trickle down through the organization, and it gets the rest of the organization aligned. And it's also the catalyst for successful organizational change strategies as well. An engaged executive sponsor can provide enterprise level support, and a feedback loop can address any roadblocks or project challenges as well. So the power of executive alignment is very real, and it's something that's an important prerequisite to ensuring that you have an effective and a successful digital transformation. So another thing, or another way to think about strategic alignment and getting that executive alignment, is to think about how we articulate the overall strategy of the organization and how we translate the strategy of the organization into a more meaningful and tangible digital strategy. And you can see on the right side of your screen here a sample that I've included a screenshot of, or at least a framework of, is really looking at different aspects of our strategy and things we're trying to accomplish as an organization, and really starting to map out how those different strategies and tactics might align with and support the overall strategic direction in the strategy of the organization. So think of it as almost a translation exercise. Most organizations we work with, in their heads, they have in their heads an understanding of what it is we're trying to accomplish as an organization strategically. Not talking about digital strategy, just as an organization, these are the top 5 or 7 goals and objectives we're trying to accomplish for the next 5 or 10 years. This is how we're going to grow as a company. This is our strategy long term. Once we understand that, then we start to unpack it and we start to cascade that down into bits and pieces of a digital strategy that align with and support that overall approach. So, for example, if an organization is really trying to fuel more top-line revenue growth, let's just say they're a more mature, slower growing multinational organization, their goal with their digital transformation and just with their overall organizational goals and objectives might be to really jumpstart and kickstart revenue growth by expanding into new markets or expanding into new products. So then we start thinking about, well, what sorts of technologies would best enable that? What sort of digital strategy and framework would best support revenue growth? And that looks a lot different than an organization that is, say, just going through a bunch of merger and acquisition integration. They're trying to go buy a bunch of companies and they want to integrate into a common business platform and operating model. Those are two very different digital strategies with different goals and objectives and different tactics that will be used from a digital strategy perspective. So we have to define the digital strategy and really translate the digital strategy from what the overarching goals and objectives are as an organization. And the strategic articulation is one way to do that. And it's a visual exercise to help start to define at the executive level what those strategies and tactics are. And it's not just the output that's important here. It's not just the output of defining what the goals and objectives of the digital strategy are, but it's also the fact that we're getting aligned as an organization and as a team. We're starting to define things in the same way, with the same language, and we're starting to row in the same direction, and we're starting to get a better understanding of what our digital strategy is and how it best enables and supports our goals and objectives as an organization. So some of the ways that we continue to unpack and get clarity on this whole concept of strategic and executive alignment, we typically will host a series of articulation workshops and decision workshops where we start to really define and unpack the strategy, as I was talking about on the previous slide, but also make key decisions in terms of what the overall transformation is and what it means to the organization. And so what I've included here is sort of an overview of some of the steps we typically will go through to help clients when they're going through this process here of getting that strategic and executive alignment. So the first thing we do is that strategic articulation workshop, which is actually meant to provide an input to the previous slide, which was the slide that I just showed you here, that gets into the strategic articulation and starts to visualize and starts to translate what some of those goals and objectives are. The second step is we'll then get into more granularity and start to look at key decision criteria workshops. So here's where we will start to make decisions around things as complex as business processes, or ranging from things like business processes to Other aspects of a transformation or decisions that need to be made, things like, do we want a standard set of business processes that are common across the world, or do we want more of a decentralized, flexible model? And you think of all these decisions as not just an either or, but sort of a continuum, and trying to define where we fall on the continuum in the spectrum of these decisions. So in these examples you see here, some of the decisions are, do we have standard common processes, or do we have flexible processes? Do we have, and by the way, you make those decisions for different functional areas throughout the organization, and you might have different answers. We also start to define, do we want to use vanilla software off the shelf, or do we want to customize to meet our needs? That's another challenge that we need to address. Do we want to have, another example would be, do we want to have, integrated set of systems, or do we want more of a best of breed approach? Those are just examples of where, we have to have alignment on those sorts of major high-level strategic parameters, or else it's really easy to get misaligned and not agree and not have clarity on where we're headed as an organization. So what we do in these exercises is we'll lay these topics of discussion, these decision points on the table, and we'll visually go through an exercise where we start off by visually representing, in red in this example, in these examples here, red is where we are today, and green is where we think we want to go in the executive team, and even broader management teams over time. As we go through iterations of this, we'll start by understanding in red where we think we are today, and you start to look at where on the continuum we are today versus where we think we want to be in the future, and that's the green dots that you see here. And so really our goal then is to look at two things. One is, how well aligned are we on where we are and where we think we're headed? In this case, you can see that we're sort of aligned on the red, which is understanding and clarifying the current state, but we're not very aligned on the future state. Those green dots are sort of all over the entire continuum. And so our job is to figure out, well, how do we get that alignment? How do we make sure that we cluster those dots closer together, and that we're all, in a similar, have a similar view of the world? And this is normal to have different opinions. You want diverse opinions, you want diversity of input into the process, but at the end of the day, you want to ensure that you align and you start going in the right direction. And so we work to align those green dots to somewhere on the dial, or somewhere on the spectrum or continuum, that best supports the overall project. And there's a series of questions and processes we go through to do that. But that's one of the big challenges, or big outputs of this exercise, is to understand and have clarity on where are we in terms of all these different decisions we need to make. And this is just a very small subset of the questions we have to go through with executives, just to give you some examples. The second thing we look at, in addition to making sure that the green and the future state direction is clustered together closer, and that we're all viewing the world similarly, is we also look at how big the gap is between the current state in red and the future state in green. The bigger that gap is, or the bigger that change is, that translates into more risk, more time, more resources that we need to factor into our overall transformation roadmap. And so that's really, part of the value of this. The unintended secondary value of this is that it also ensures that we have an understanding of the magnitude of change, which will allow us to define a transformation strategy and roadmap that's more aligned with reality and what it is we as an organization are trying to accomplish. And then the third step in this process is we identify the gaps, the risks, and the findings, and that we use this to inform our overall digital strategy and roadmap and overall transformation plan. You'll see too, one of the things we use, or one of the frameworks we use in the bottom right corner here, is a graphic that it's very difficult to read. I can't even read it on my screen right now, this screenshot. But what that is that's a screenshot of 13 different dimensions that we typically assess and evaluate risk with transformation projects, beginning with the initial strategy phase all the way through implementation and go live and everything. We use this framework to manage risk and to identify and mitigate risk along the way. And so that's a good way to think about this, is to think about how can you bring in the tools and the resources and the outside help to help you frame this in a way that will help you identify and mitigate risk along the way, and certainly ultimately get to that point where you have that strategic alignment early on in the project. And then finally, as we get through this, we go through recommendations and alignment plan, and then we repeat the process as necessary. I mentioned before that it's a very iterative process. It's not something where you just have a workshop with some executives, you clarify your overall strategy, and you move on. That's what software vendors typically do, because typically what they're trying to do is they're just trying to get to know the business well enough to start building software, which is what they're really good at. But what we need to do as an organization is slow down, make sure that we have that clarity, that we've worked through these decisions, and that we have alignment on these decisions before we start getting into to build software. And a good way to think about everything I'm talking about here today is to really think of this all as sort of a phase 0 two-year transformation project. I know it's tempting to want to just jump in and let's just go pick a software, let's go start deploying software. And again, that's what software vendors do, because that's what they're good at. That's how they make money. But in order for you to be successful, you have to think of your overall transformation project, as a long journey. And you're going to set that aside for a second. That's coming up. That's coming soon. But in the meantime, we need to do this phase 0 where we get this alignment, we get this internal clarity on where it is we're headed. So that we can be more effective when we get to the actual transformation, but B, so that we are sure that we have the right transformation plan and roadmap to begin with. Because more often than not, we just jump right into an implementation plan and resource plan and overall strategy that's not aligned, as we're talking about here today. And when it's not aligned, we don't have a realistic vision of what that implementation really is. So then we end up running into problems like our projects get delayed, we go over budget, people get burned out and stressed out. Those are the sorts of things that we've got to make sure we mitigate. And that's part of how this whole phase 0 and this whole strategic alignment process, which is part of phase 0. There's other things that happen within that. And that's part of what Dean and Wayne will talk about later, are things like defining your target operating model. That's something we'll talk about here after my session, is how do we define that target operating model? And we want to define that target operating model, the future state, in the context of what it is we say we're trying to accomplish strategically as an organization, so that we're not just shooting in the dark, that we actually have a clear plan for that. So that's how this all ties together into the grand scheme of things, in the sort of phase 0 mentality of make sure we have a solid strategy and alignment before we start building and deploying technology.
Yeah, and Eric, I think it's a good time to just address some of these questions real quick before we move on. So we have some great questions in our questions and answer queue. You can definitely put them there or put them in the chat. Either way, we're monitoring them. So this is an interesting one. Does third stage face any discontent from clients when we say something like, I think you might need to revise your broader corporate vision in your company? And I'll answer that one. Absolutely yes. But I'll let Eric elaborate on that. So we have some other questions just about executive alignment. So if you can just kind of talk to us about how, as a consultant or as an outside party, how do you have that conversation with your clients in a way that shows legitimacy of that you know the business and that you are that trusted advisor? How does that work?
Well, I think the first thing is to resist the temptation to come in and say that a client is right or wrong. I mean, our job is never to tell a client that they're wrong, or they don't know what they're doing, or that they have the wrong strategy. Generally, organizations have a pretty clear and effective understanding of what it is they need to accomplish as an organization strategically. So how they're going to grow the company, how they're going to be more profitable, more successful, more effective, all that sort of thing. Sometimes they don't, and obviously we've got to help in those cases and help them articulate the overarching strategy. But more often than not, they know what their general strategy is, but where they fail is they don't translate that strategy into something that matches from a transformation perspective. So in other words, they get caught up in the allure of a hot new technology that they're just going to deploy, that's going to solve all their problems and help them achieve all their strategic goals and objectives, without really defining, well, how is artificial intelligence, for example, how is artificial intelligence going to help you and align with the overall strategy, and what's the focus of artificial intelligence, and where are we going to deploy it? That's just one example of how we might think that through. But in general, yeah, it's more a matter of articulating and translating what they already know to be their corporate goals and objectives into a digital strategy, more so than it is helping them define their organizational strategy in the first place.
Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense in helping them to kind of consume and define their strategic visioning and that alignment process. So keep those questions coming, folks. I will make sure that Eric addresses a lot of them at the end, and we'll move on here to talk more about some granular tactics.
Sure. Sounds good. Thank you. So here's an example, or just a sample of a strategic articulation workshop that we do for clients, and this is where we start to define in some more detail what the overall strategy is, and it's a way that we get to that strategic development and articulation. And to Kyler's point in the question from the audience around, how do you deliver that bad news to clients that they don't have a good strategy, or that they haven't thought through this completely. It's really not necessarily, it's not bad news typically when we're doing this, because the good news is we're helping through the process now. I'd say where the bad news comes in is if you haven't thought through these things, you haven't started to make some of these decisions, that's where I would suggest you're going to run into problems if you haven't made some of these decisions as an executive team and gone through the iterations and through some of the pain and the messiness of having to define what some of these decisions are. So this is where we get into defining that strategy, the critical priorities and initiatives, some of the key decisions that need to be made so that we have some frameworks and parameters to define a transformation roadmap and strategy that fits our business and what it is we're trying to accomplish, and it fits our priorities. It's also a way to confirm alignment and accountability and measure success and mitigate risks and get to next steps that align with the overall strategy. So this sample agenda is something that we do. In this case, this is over a 1-week process. We conducted a series of workshops for this client for this particular iteration or phase of the strategic articulation workshop. So the key here is that we want to take those conceptual models that I talked about in the previous slides that you see summarized on the right side of the screen. You want to start to translate that into more tactical, actionable agenda items within a workshop setting to help get to some of those outputs that will then lead to and provide inputs to other outputs like the digital transformation plan and the overall roadmap and strategy. So I was talking earlier about some of the examples of decisions we need to make as an organization and decisions that we need to make sure that we're aligned on a team as. So for example, and this comes back to the question that Kyler brought up from the audience a moment ago, which is how do you ensure that a client or an organization has an effective strategy, is you want to make sure that you have just clarity on the strategy, that you're aligned on the strategy, and that the different strategic decisions that we have to make, they should be aligned with and support the overarching corporate or organizational goals and objectives. And that's where you have problems, is when there's a disconnect. I always tell clients that it's better that you have an aligned and clear strategy that's imperfect than to have a perfect strategy that isn't as well defined or isn't as well understood, or that we're not as well aligned on. Even though it might be a superior strategy, the fact that you're not aligned internally means that I'll take the imperfect strategy where there is alignment. That's generally going to be more successful. That's generally going to give you more tailwinds instead of headwinds. And it's going to allow you to reach that third stage of success that we were talking about earlier. And so that begs the question, well, what are these decisions we have to make? If we, do we have to decide on what software vendor we're going to deploy, or do we have to decide on, the phasing strategy of the software? That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is even more fundamental and more basic from a strategic level. But we've got to have that basic foundation in place before we can get to some of those other later decisions that we tend to rush into more often than not. So some of those decisions are things like I mentioned before, standard versus flexible processes. And by the way, some of these decisions are decisions that need to be made repeatedly or be made for different parts of the organization. So for example, your finance group might say, we want very standard processes, and we're going to fall on the left side of that spectrum of standard processes versus flexible processes. But when you get to your customer service or your sales group, you might find that, well, that group is going to be a little bit more flexible because we need flexibility to adjust to customer needs, or maybe we have a very customized product, and that customization is what makes us different and sets us apart from our competitors. So therefore, our production, our product lifecycle design, or our production processes might need to be more flexible. Whatever the case may be, we want to define those decisions for different parts of the business. We also have a system strategy. Do we want a single ERP system? Do we want a best of breed? And by the way, for all these decisions, part of our job is to say there is no easy answer here. There's always a trade off. There's always pros and cons and strengths and weaknesses of any one of these decisions. But the key is to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we can rationalize and justify how these decisions support the overarching goals and objectives of the company. And just as importantly, make sure that we're aligned on those decisions. There's also another example is the last one on this slide, which is, we as an organization, do we want to go through massive amounts of change? Or are we more risk adverse? Are we more, maybe we're just more of an organization where slower tempo or more incremental tempo makes more sense? How much change do we really want to take on as an organization? That's a really important question and a really important decision that has to be made, because if we don't have alignment on that, we're going to have unrealistic expectations. You're going to have part of the team that thinks that we should be just taking our time and doing things slowly and incrementally. You have other people that think we should be really aggressive. We should just go all in on this transformation now. And those are two very different strategies with different roadmaps and tactics to support them. So we need to make sure we have that alignment. There's other things around, what kind of system deployment approach do we take? That may sound a bit technical, but it's still something that we need to define as an organization and have clarity on as an organization. Are we going to take a waterfall approach, an agile approach, some sort of mix of both? How much of our data are we going to bring over? How do we want to change our culture? That's a big, massive undertaking, or not in terms of time and resources, but just in terms of, the importance of defining that culture and what we want the culture to be and how much of a change we want it to be. So these are just some examples, some additional examples of decisions that need to be made and things where we need to get alignment and understanding before we get too far into our transformation. And then when we get to the gaps, risks, and findings, typically what we want to do is, give a readout of what we found and where we landed on some of these decisions, but also analyze and identify the risks. What are the risks with what we just decided or what we're in the process of deciding? For example, if we decided that we're leaning very heavily towards a standard model with very vanilla software to support the business processes, we want common business processes across the globe. That's fine. That might be perfectly aligned with what our overarching strategy is as an organization. But now we need to look at the dark side. What are the risks of doing what we just said we're going to do? Now, the good news is we've got common vanilla processes with common vanilla technologies to support those processes. The bad news is now we've just put more pressure on the people side of the equation, and now change management is going to be even a bigger risk than it was before, than it was already. So that doesn't necessarily change our decision, or maybe it does, but even if it doesn't change our decision on where we land on the spectrum of things, now we've got to figure out, okay, what are we going to do from a change perspective to ensure that we're being more comprehensive and that we're addressing these risks that we've now introduced now that we've made these decisions. So there's risk mitigation. That's another really important part of that phase zero part of the transformation, to make sure that we understand those risks so that we have a deployment plan to address those risks and mitigate those risks along the way. And I'm gonna skip through this and just show you. I'll show you right here just a project approach that we took with a recent client. You could ignore the timelines for now. This is more of a mid-size organization that was not extremely short, but not extremely long a process either. Larger organizations might take more time to go through this process. Smaller organizations might take less time. But generally, this is sort of that process we go through to get that alignment and to use some of these tool sets that we've talked about so far in today's conversation to really leverage these frameworks and to get to the point where we're able to mobilize. We get through the workshops to start to get that alignment with the steerco and with the PMO and with the overall project team. We get to the decisions around the different variables that we need decisions on, and then we have recommendations and a roadmap that come out of that to ensure that we have that roadmap that's in alignment. So, this really ranges from anywhere from a handful of weeks to, in some cases, it could take have extreme misalignment as an organization. This could take more than just a few months. And if that's the case, then you do start to have to ask the
think we might have lost Eric for a minute here. He's lost in the cloud, as I always like to say when we have internet issues. So we'll keep moving here. I'm going to look at some of the questions while Eric gets reconnected, and we can kind of address them because there's some really interesting pieces on here. So when we're talking about, Sarah had a great one. What is the right time for your team to make decisions on overall business strategy during transformation? She referenced specifically CRM here, but I think this can go for any project. As Eric just mentioned, the most important thing is being able to address those at the beginning of the project. So I'm getting some feedback that I'm not to hear, so I'm going to unmute my mic and tell me if it's better or tell me if it's worse in emojis. But so basically what we're going to want to do here is make sure that we are defining those business strategies before we're selecting the technology. And when we look at all of those different things, it's important to have those requirements as far as business definition in the actual strategic documents or requirements before looking at any sort of CRM system or different technology. So hopefully that's a little better, and hopefully you can hear me a little bit better while we get Eric back with us here to keep going through some different project approaches here and keep on with our slide deck. So if you can hear me better now, give me a thumbs up. If it's still kind of hard, give me a thumbs down. And I'll keep moving through this question. So we got one about third stage. We work with SAP or ERP or general digital transformation. So basically, what we work with is all things digital transformation. So any sort of technology implementation, selection, those types of things we work with. And so it sounds like we're still having some trouble with the sound. So let me just mute real quick and then we'll jump back in. So keep those questions coming. We'll give it about a 2-minute break and then we'll come back with Eric to answer some of your questions. And I'll put that in the chat as well. So give me a few minutes and we'll kind of fix this up. Thanks, team. Hi, everyone. Okay, we're testing sound again. Can you hear me better? Can you hear me worse? Let me know in the chat. Great, excellent. So we are going to take a quick break. So Eric couldn't get back on, but he can still see all of your questions. So keep those coming in the actual questions and answers piece. So I'm glad we can all hear now. I'm going to try and turn on my video. Just cross your fingers. It's not going to to make me quiet again. So keep that feedback coming. The one thing I did want to address that I had some questions on about the question I did answer here. We talked about when is important to define your strategy when looking at a new technology implementation. So the thing we were talking about before we lost Eric was just making sure that that's defined at the beginning of the project and it's very clear within the requirements before looking at a new technology. Our approach at Third Stage is always letting the business strategy and the business needs drive the technology, not the other way around. And then the other thing we wanted to address when it came to implementation failures for executive alignment, that's a lot of times where Third Stage comes in to triage projects. Many times that's a bulk of our work is coming in to fix projects that are broken. So again, that goes along with the question I just addressed earlier, is making sure that that strategic approach is very clear and that alignment is secured, as Eric said. That's going to be really the key to making sure that your risk for failure is much lower, because you can kind of spend to fix it and that's going to blow your budget and blow your timeline after being able to triage it. So hi, Wayne. Welcome to the stage.
Hi Kyla, how you going? Great to be here.
Excellent. Well, I heard a little echo in the background here. So if you want to mute real quick, Dean and Wayne, I'll go ahead and introduce you, and then we can make sure that we introduce our great APAC team here. So as always, our digital stratospheres are kind of a journey when it comes to technology. The funny part we always joke about is we're technology executives that sometimes struggle with technology, as most people do. So the cool part about the Crowdcast platform is it is incredibly engaging. And that's our main priority when it comes to these events, is being able to engage with our audience and make sure that we can address your questions. So the good part about all of those great questions we have, specifically when it comes to testing and those low code or no code software pieces, Dean and Wayne are both experts in that area, so we can get to those questions as well. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to welcome Dean to the stage, and he is going to share his next keynote. Since we already got a little break in there, I'm going to keep moving on so we can stay to our timeline. But Dean's going to talk about defining a target operating model. Dean is one of our directors within the Hong Kong area. So I'm going to, of course, as I always love to do, ask him to introduce himself in language so that we can, have some international conversations. I will tell you that if you put any information or any chats in Chinese, I'm going to have to stop so that he can read them. But that's always great to be able to have that global lens. So with that, I will turn it over to Dean to introduce himself. So what we're going to do, Wayne, is just at the top of your screen there, if you can just mute your mic and then also turn off your video, we'll turn it over to Dean. Can you hear us, Dean?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you see my screen?
We cannot see your screen quite yet, but it might take a minute. That share screen at the top is the icon. If you hover like right over your head, you can kind of see it. Oh, there we go. Perfect.
All right.
Looking great. Excellent. Well, we'll turn it over to you so you can show us about some target operating model. And again, I am monitoring that chat, so feel free to put questions down there for Dean. And then also in the Ask a Question area, you can vote on the questions that you'd like us to answer from a priority standpoint. So feel free to engage with that. I also want to just mention the poll feature before we get started. It's great to see that most of our audience is going through a digital transformation as we speak, which is very exciting because these are excellent tactics and strategies that you can translate to your own project. And I see many of you are considering it too. So I'd love to hear what your considerations is, or if you're going through a project right now, what some of your experience is. So let's start that dialogue in the chat while Dean teaches us about a target operating model.
All right, 大家好，你们好。Well, just I want to say it's a really special day for me because I'm very grateful for having this opportunity. I'm grateful for Wayne and Eric. Just want to share a quick story. It was 4 or 5 years ago when I was attending the Digital Stratosphere as a participant, and that's when I got in touch with Eric. We stayed in touch over LinkedIn, and about a year ago, he contacted me for a project based out of Hong Kong, and the project went well. And then soon after, I became one of the members of Third Stage APAC, and Wayne and myself, we represent the region. So it's quite the opportunity here to be able to be a speaker this time at the Digital Stratosphere. So I hope I'll be able to show you a few things, and you'll be able to use them in your upcoming digital transformation. So today's session would be about defining that future operating model. And a part of that future operating model, Eric has already touched upon it quite a bit in terms of that executive alignment. So there's going to be a bit of crossover in terms of what Eric showed you and what I'll be presenting. First off, I'd like to share with you our third stage end-to-end digital enablement methodology. And really, roughly, it's based out of 4 major steps. And Eric talked about that digital strategy piece, and Kyler reiterated how important it is to develop that beforehand, because your digital strategy will be your driver in your next steps, whether it's a digital transformation, whether it's an ERP implementation. And that's going to allow you in the second step to properly choose which ERP solution you require for your business that satisfies the business and process requirements of your business. Once that selection is done and you have negotiated your contracts, then we also help our clients in that pre-implementation and readiness and change management piece. And like Eric shared, change management is pretty much the number one reason where digital transformation fail. And we really take the time and put a lot of energy with our clients to set up their steering committee members, to set up their project teams, to develop their change management strategies, and to follow up on the change management initiatives. And lastly, this is where really the fun starts, and it's during that implementation piece of the solution. We help our clients to make sure that what the system integrator or the vendor has promised, that they're actually delivering on them. And at the end of the day, once the system is implemented, you're getting the value out of that investment. So in terms of that digital strategy piece, and that's where the operating model sits under that digital strategy piece, is you have that strategic and executive alignment, which we're going to touch upon quickly. And then that's how you're going to start building that future operating model for your organization. So those are the 2 main work streams for this presentation on the digital strategy. As you've seen earlier in Eric's presentation, there were other work streams that fell under that digital strategy piece. So what are the outcomes from not having a digital strategy? I think that's important. If we take away that digital strategy from that end-to-end digital enablement methodology, what do you get out of it? Well, firstly is your solution, there's a good chance that your solution doesn't capture that end-to-end or multifunctional processes in order to deliver business outcomes. Because a digital strategy looks at the organization as a whole and how they should be connected. But when you look at it only at a technology point of view or at an ERP point of view and looking at the modules, you're not going to get that interconnectivity that you require because you're going to be looking more at the modular point of view of the solution. So therefore, instead of being an enabler to better operate, that solution that you have invested a lot of money will start dictating how you eventually have to operate. And I think we've heard and we've seen that kind of outcome maybe in your current organization or in past organizations where, oh my goodness, the solution can't do this, so I have to work around the solution, or if I wanted, or I have to highly customize the solution because that interconnection, that information interconnection isn't there between the modules. So therefore, the solution actually dictates on how you have to operate. And that's the reason of why having a digital strategy and an operating model is so important. And in terms of selecting your ERP, you become reactive and bound to the offerings of the solution vendor or reseller. So instead of telling the solution vendor, well, this is my operating model, these are the modules that are required to support my operating model, and therefore show me what you have in your suite of modules. That's the right way to go about, instead of having the reseller sharing with you everything that they have, and you'll get easily enticed by what it offers. But does it fit into your digital strategy? It could be a nice to have, but is it worth that investment so far right away? And ultimately, if you don't have a digital strategy and you rely on system integrators to just implement a solution, often or not, you end up having a generic implementation that struggles to deliver the value that you need for your business. So we all talk about the best practices, and ERP follows best practices, and best practice offers certain value. But is that the right value for your business based on your strategy? So those are certain outcomes that you can that we can find by not having a digital strategy. So how do we go about in building a digital strategy and building that operating model? Well, let's put aside the technology piece. Let's put aside the solution, and let's get back to business management basics. Let's look at what's changed in the business landscape of the organization, of the market. Are there any disruptors in the market that we need to consider? Are there other areas or other opportunities that we need to be looking at? We'll have to start, let's define the key value drivers and core competencies that we require to thrive in this ever-changing market. And that's where you start to rethink how you want to operate, right? And what would be your future operating model, the right processes that you need to have. So what do I need to operate in this new landscape? And then you start looking, do I actually need an ERP to operate in that way? So the first 4 points are the first questions that you should be asking. And only at the 5th point, then you're questioning yourself, do I actually need an ERP, and will that support my new way of operating? And once you have, your team has made a decision that that an ERP would be beneficial and would be required to support that new operating model, then we start looking at what is the appropriate functional architecture for my ERP. So what do I really need to run my future operating model, and ensuring that I'm not buying too much or too little. If I buy too much, there'll be certain modules that I'm investing subscription and licenses that do end up becoming shelfware. So let's move on to in terms of the mechanics of defining that operating model. We first start by selecting the business topics that we're going to go through with the different stakeholders, the executives at the client end. And we could be going through a different number of topics. And usually there are two different categories of topics that we can run through them. One of them are policy-related topics in terms of governance. So how do they want to manage their approval processes? In terms of information management, in terms of if they're going through a ever-changing market, how do they want to respond to that ever-changing market? And what is their growth and plan for the future? Another type of topics that we would also deliberate with the executive group during these workshops to define their operating models, it could be topics more functionally related. So how do they see in the future, how would they like to manage their procurement processes? Or how do they see their future supply chain and distribution networks coming along? How do they like to manage their sales and demand planning? And also, a very important piece is that master data management piece, which it's a really key critical success factor for any implementation. And Eric talked about data migration and so forth, and that falls into that space as well. So we learn about the organization. We understand their predicaments, their situations, and we identified what are those key topics that we should be raising during the early stage of the workshops to build that operating model. Once those topics are defined, for example, governance is one of the topics, we start building that spectrum, all right? And we're looking at, and we start defining at both ends of the spectrum, what does it represent? So on one end of governance, on the left side, is more of an outcome-focused governance and authority kind of model. And on the right side is more hierarchical governance, so based on position and hierarchy. And also, what we provide to the stakeholders is, well, some certain descriptions or model delivery observations on what do these spectrums, each end of the spectrums represent. And in this case, we're outlining what are the pros and cons. Another example, more on the functional side, for example, on procurement management, let's say if an organization has gone through certain mergers and acquisitions, and so they want to combine certain entities, and they want to see what is the best way to manage procurement at the group level between all these entities. So we'll look at different type of models that could exist, whether it's a centralized model that everything is done from a centralized office, or a decentralized model where each entity or each site manages their own procurement, or you want something that's more hybrid, where you have certain roles and responsibilities sitting at the group level, and maybe more on the strategic side of procurement. And then you have at the entity level, at the site level, that are managing more the operational day-to-day side of purchasing. So we will provide those model delivery observations just to help build clarity of what do these spectrums represent. And from there, we ask the stakeholders to plot their current state points along the spectrum, as well as their future state points. So the current state are the red dots, and the future state are the green dots. As you see in governance, one of the outcomes that we can find is you have certain executives that are very much aligned in terms of where they are currently, in terms of their governance model, and where they want to be, and they want to move more to an outcome focus driven model. So therefore, providing ownership provide ownership to the different users, so they can make the decisions, and not always having to go through different reporting lines to get approval, which could stagnate growth, and which could stagnate stagnate the speed of business. Another example that we could find is, well, there's quite a difference between the views of different executives of where they currently stand and where they want to go, and that's where we have to talk it out. And it's better to have this kind of visualization where you see different executives being, not being aligned, because this is where, they need to talk it through. What are the pros and cons to go decentralized and centralized? And that's the purpose of those workshops. And at least you get that done now before you implement, for example, that procurement module for your ERP. So once those discussions have been made during those workshops, and what's required to achieve the future state, we usually record all these sessions, because there's a lot of information that comes out from all those stakeholders, and we re-listen to these to what they've shared and what are their views, and we help start articulating what are the operating principles. And the operating principles is really what drives or what defines that future operating model. So a definition of what is an operating principle they are executive statements to provide guidance and influence new ways of working, to support transformation initiatives aimed at delivering benefits and realizable outcomes. So they're actually statements or guidelines by the executive on how we should be running the business, how we should operate the business. And those are very, very powerful, because it gives them now a solid framework, a solid basis to drive the next steps of the digital strategy. And here are certain examples of operating principles that came out of the governance topic. One of them is, we have the appropriate risk-based controls for approvals and sign-offs, considering the relevant governance framework of each business unit. Another one is, we have clear definition of roles accountable for approvals and sign-offs, thus limiting excessive multi-level approvals. So those are clear statements on what the executives are looking for in terms of managing their governance model. In terms of procurement management, one of the principles is we centrally manage our supplier relationships to leverage strategic partnerships and to evaluate our supplier base through a consolidated vendor performance reporting system. So this is where they really want to go into a consolidation mode, a centralized mode to manage their entire pool of suppliers. And during this exercise, we usually get out of 2 or 3, or it could be 4 different principles out of each topic. So one thing I like to share is what are some 3 key characteristics in order to define or to identify or to draft your operating principles. First thing, your statement has to be in present tense. It's not "we will do this," it's "we have this," or "we are currently performing this." So it has to be in present tense. You already have to believe that it's already working with you, is working in the organization, and that helps to crystallize and that operating principles and drive how to get that how to bring that to life in your organization. The next piece is that operating principle serves for the executive team and steering committee, serves as a clear indicator that the ERP implementation project is on the right track to achieving its objective. So those, like I said earlier, those are the basis and framework to drive your next steps in your digital strategy or your ERP and digital transformation journey. And along the way, during the different project gates that you have to go through, the different project meetings, the steering codes, we're always going to rely, are these operating principles have they been designed into the processes? Have they been designed into the build? Have they been designed into the change management program? And that's all the steering committee and executive should be looking at in terms of knowing that the ERP investment is going towards the right direction. So it's those operating principles is a very strategic way of defining your digital strategy. And at the end, once the solution is delivered, the project is completed, the principles is basically it's have you ticked off that principle? Is it recognized as being delivered? Yes or no? And it's very easy to identify if it's been ticked off or not at the end of the day. So those are those three characteristics that we feel are important in terms of defining or writing up a well-written operating principle.
And Dean, I wonder if we can jump in with just a few of these questions here in the questions and answers area. I think this is a good time to address one of our top voted questions here, which is the obviously digital transformation is a big journey, workshops, projects, sub-projects, meetings, interviews, and so on. At what point or at what circumstance do you meet the most resistance or fatigue on the client side when you participate in a project? Can you help us understand that?
In terms of fatigue, I would say change management is a very stressful area for executives and for clients, because this is an area where roles and responsibilities will have to change whenever we start looking at the org structure and so forth. And this could be a very taxing part, both from the executives who have to drive that change, but also it could be also stressful for the functional people also, because they know that maybe their current roles and responsibilities might change along the way.
Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. When it comes to this operating principle, can you give us an idea of when this should be defined within a digital transformation timeline?
Oh, it should be, I would consider as step 0, like Eric was mentioning. It should be done ideally at the very start, when you're even before you're considering to select a solution, having those operating principles. And I'll show some examples later of even before selecting an ERP solution, how having clear operating principles can help in that selection process.
Absolutely. And if you are an organization that is working to do kind of this phase 0 pre-work, what are some resources that you can look at when defining a future state operating model or a target operating model, when that may not be your day-to-day roles and responsibilities?
Are you talking at the client side, I'm assuming?
Yeah, so basically, if you're starting out and you want to say, hey, I'm defining my operating model or my operating principles, what are some things that they can start to do? Would it be to engage an expert, or would it be to follow a certain framework? What are just some pre-work examples of what organizations can do today within their circle of influence?
Well, I think the first step, based on the mechanics, is to define which topics you like to cover, and that could start from the CEO, which topics that needs to be discussed, and then have his executive team start deliberating on what they think is important. The greatest thing about these operating principles is the discussion, really. And when you have discussions between, let's say, the CFO, the CEO, the head of operations, the head of HR, working together in defining common operating principles, is a great thing to see. As a consultant, when we take part in these discussions and these workshops, and when we have everyone around all the key heads of the organization working together and building multifunctional operating principles, that's a great feeling, because then the chances of succeeding in your digital transformation and your ERP project, to have that full coverage and full integration of the organization, really sets you on the right foot, puts you on the right foot.
Absolutely. That's so well said. That dialogue and just that open feedback loop is certainly important. So keep those questions coming, folks. You can put them in the chat or the questions and answers section. You can vote on your favorite, and I'll let Dean get back to these characteristics of an operating principle.
Yeah, just the certain things I'm just thinking about from these questions, and about having materials ahead of time. When we're going through these workshops and these discussions with the executives, they have a very clear idea of what they need, maybe at their department level. But now when you start looking at it interdepartmentally, that's when the magic happens, and that's the beauty of these operating principles. But at the end of the day, we believe that the executives know what they want. It's just about articulating them and collecting their information, and then building those right, articulating and building those right operating principles at the end. So that was the mechanics, and here I'd like to share with you certain, certain case studies. It's not really a case study where we're going in depth in a specific client, but we'd like to share with you three examples on where we've engaged this type of work stream with three types of clients, where we've helped them define their operating model, and more importantly, define their operating principles. So case one is with a vertically integrated utilities company. Case two, it has to do with a manufacturer that through mergers and acquisitions is looking to incorporate a new entity within their existing ERP. And the third case is a manufacturer that has outgrown its current ERP solution and is looking to replace their ERP. So for this first case about on this vertically integrated utilities company, this is a multinational organization, and it's composed of numerous business units which are operating independently. And they spent quite a bit of time with other consulting firms to conduct the visioning exercises to develop their new business model for the future. And when we talk about visioning a new business model, is by clearly identifying their mission, vision, and values. But while they're building that new business model, they are also looking to implement a brand new ERP to replace their legacy ERP that's been running for over I think 25 years. So the challenge here is, how do we translate those visioning exercises, those outputs, into actual ERP requirements? And that's where the operating principles provide that tangible outcome on how the organization is to operate with this new ERP. And here, I'm just going to share with you one operating principle that came out of this exercise. With this client, I think we got about 25 different operating principles that came out of this work stream. And let me just read it out here. Is we have process and information visibility of shared resources across business units. We can effectively coordinate and plan the delivery of new cross-business initiatives and programs. So like I was mentioning, they have different, they operate with numerous business units working right now very much in silo. And in their new ERP requirements, there needs to be process and information visibility between these business units, because in their new way of working, they'll have more initiatives, more projects that cut across those different business units. So their ERP needs to be able to do the same. So I think this is one very nice example in terms of the executive sharing what they require for their ERP. So during the steer codes, during the the QA, the delivery assurance meetings, executives can say, how do these business units connect while we're going through a cross-business initiative? Those simple questions will make sure that we have the right answers and that the system is being well designed accordingly. The second case is through mergers and acquisitions, where a manufacturer is looking to incorporate a new entity. So you have entity A, which is using ERP X, and entity B with an ERP Y. And the result is at the group level, where you have both entities consolidated, all of them would be using ERP X. And the sales vision is to consolidate both entities, form an integrated planning platform. That was the desire of the CEO. So the challenge is, what does this integrated planning platform look like? How will you consolidate at the group level? How does it look like, that consolidation piece at the group level? So the operating principles offer that opportunity to really crystallize how that consolidation would look like. Here are two examples of operating principles that came about this exercise. First one has to do with their sales and customer service department, where it has to be integrated, consolidated at a singular point, so they can service all customers relating to activities cutting across all product families. So no two sales team, no two customer service teams based on entities, but just one consolidated team. The next one is about master data management. It's across all sites, we abide by the same master data structure and data definition requirements. So it's very, very clear and obvious what the executive is looking for through this consolidation of this new entity in the ERP. They don't want this, although they'll be using the same ERP vendor or the same ERP brand, but they don't want two separate instances working in tandem. They want one instance working together. So they have to share the same master data files and have the same data definition. So it's very clear what they desire through their digital strategy. The next case is a manufacturer who has outgrown its current ERP solution. And they have already done quite a bit of analysis internally in terms of their current processes, what are their current pain points, and so forth. But oftentimes when you do these these process maps of your as is and you identify pain points are often just a symptom, but not the actual root cause of the problems of the system. So there's a lot of more work to be done in terms of identifying those root causes. And this client has engaged Third Stage to conduct a requirements-based evaluation scan of the appropriate ERP solutions. So they're looking for us to find to evaluate the best solutions for them, and we propose them to go through the operating model exercise, because that will allow them to give them the best chance of success in terms of finding or identifying the right solutions. But firstly, before finding the right or choosing the right solution, is identifying what you really need. What are your business requirements for the ERP, for your ERP, especially your cross-functional requirements. So those operating principles that we have developed, what we help them develop, will allow to derive that functional architecture and modules required for their future ERP. So again, making sure that they have the right modules and not buying too much or not enough. And this is one example of an operating principle that came out of this exercise. Is we assess the value trade-off between the cost of carrying additional end products versus changeover and productivity costs to accurately optimize the scheduling of our mixed model production lines. So here, if we unpack this statement, we're touching upon different modules that are required to deliver this actual operating principle. We're talking about inventory here in terms of identifying your locations in order to identify what are the carrying costs incurred per inventory location. We're talking about changeover and productivity and scheduling. So you require that manufacturing management module where your bill of operations and your routings have to be well defined. And then financials, where your cost allocations have to be well connected with your manufacturing management and your inventory management piece. And also what's required, and that sits below those three modules, is a business intelligence system in order to be able to calculate and develop those scenarios to assess and to ascertain that value trade-off that's required in order to develop the right scenario for their scheduling. So just by developing operating principles, again, here it's very multifunctional, and we also understand now what modules are required, but also how they have to be linked together, and that's where you really get the value out of your solutions, by linking modules together and not having them working separately. So the key inputs of the operating principles are huge, because they're inputs to the other pieces or the other initiatives in our digital enablement methodology. So we've shared about the ERP selection piece with the case 3, where the manufacturer has outgrown their solution. So that operating model defines what modules are required, what functional architecture is required. And then you can start evaluating the different options of solutions based on how each solution scores in terms of their robustness and functionalities of every module. So you have a clear framework or a clear evaluation grid on how you go about your ERP evaluation process. So and you can quantify it, and that's really important. Next is that pre-implementation readiness and change management. And actually, with one of the clients that we've shared in one of those 3 cases, they were very, very how can I say, they saw a lot of value out of those operating principles, and they have continued to engage with us in order to implement those operating principles in their change management initiatives. And that's where we're embarking with our change management consulting and working with their teams in order to realize those operating principles. And a last piece is that implementation project and delivery assurance. And like I've mentioned, those operating principles become the basis of the executive team and the board members of those organizations to see if really the project is it on the right track? Is it going to deliver the right business outcomes that we're expecting at the end of the day? So they become really great guidelines to the senior management. And finally, I'd like to finish off with this slide about the takeaways from having a digital strategy. And if you recall earlier in the beginning of my presentation, I talked about the outcomes of not having a digital strategy. And one of the outcomes is not being able to capture end-to-end or multifunctional processes in order to deliver business outcomes. But when you have these principles, those principles are already designed specifically to deliver an outcome. And that's what's great about those principles. They've already written out. It's not a aspirational kind of goal you're providing. Those principles are actual statements that they can be ticked off and said that they were actually delivered in the business. Also, those principles are naturally based on cross-functional discussions between the executive team. And we cannot build principles just by having 1 or 2 individuals around the table. You require a team that covers all aspects of the organization. One of the challenges or problems without a digital strategy is, well, the system is not enabling you to better operate. And at the end of the day, the solution dictates on how you're operating. But by having those principles as the executive guidelines, they drive your future processes to build the solution. And that's what's so great about those principles, is they will drive how your future processes should be defined. And you eliminate those system workarounds and those and having a system that's very, that's highly customized, because thanks to those principles, you have already taken consideration what are the different interconnectivity requirements that are required in your ERP platform. Just like the example earlier, where we understood from one principle how the financial module should be connected to the inventory module, and how it should be connected to the manufacturing module to better schedule production. Next is become what you're no longer reactive and bound to the offerings of the solution vendor or reseller, because now you can tell them and you can tell them confidently, these are the modules that I require. So show me those modules, and now you can start seeing the modules that you really need to be delivered in your business. And ultimately, here, the last challenge is you end up with a generic implementation that struggles to deliver value. And I think this is the most important takeaway. Those principles are not just based on best practices or vanilla processes that ERP offer, but those principles are developed by your organization and for your organization only. So they become your actual DNA on how you want to operate. So no one can take that away from you, because they were developed by you only, and you own those principles. So really, you're building the right processes and you're building the right solution design to meet your actual business requirements, not the business requirements that are coming from simply from an out of the box ERP, for example.
I think that's a really interesting segue, Dean, into just kind of the dialogue that we're having here in the chat, which I always love kind of these opinions. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'll go back to a few other questions that people had. But basically, you had just touched on what it means to buy kind of an off-the-shelf software and be kind of tied to that functionality. And similarly, we're having some conversation around kind of who is the king of ERP in the APAC region. And we're talking about how perception often kind of seems to transcend the actual need of the business or the organization. So I wondered if you might speak to that from a regional perspective of how you might be able to kind of flip that perception and get the business to actually do what they need, as opposed to maybe be enchanted with a bigger vendor that might not be perfect or a great fit for their business.
Well, we when we speak to potential clients, we also see the scenario where clients or potential clients don't choose Third Stage as a partner in order to build that digital strategy and build those operating principles, and go straight to the system integrator, because they believe the system integrator has everything that they have to offer. But at the end of the day, a system integrator, what they are there for you is basically selling a system and implementing it and moving on to the next job. And unfortunately, they don't have time to really take a really deep dive on your business requirements. They do review your processes and what they require, but do they take the time to really redefine your new data structure? Do they take the time to redefine what are all the interfunctional connectivities that could help optimize your business and functional outcomes and so forth. So this is where we come along and we help them through this exercise of articulating the operating principles. Clients see a lot of value in saying, oh, now I had a vision, or I had a good sense of how the company should operate, but now through these principles, now they could start seeing it materialize it even more and see how information should flow between departments, but also within modular applications.
Absolutely. I think from a functional perspective, that makes a lot of sense. I'm wondering, so D365, for all of you that are kind of talking about it in the comments, again, great dialogue, is on the top of our top 10 ERP systems. We make that list globally from a lot of industry research we do, obviously from our client case studies and just overall support within the marketplace. It seems from our feedback here with our APAC stakeholders is D365 is not a well-known or not sought after, it sounds like, based on this product or based on this conversation, product in the APAC region. Is that something that you've experienced on the third stage side with some of your clients and in that space?
Well, D365 is it's a very popular product, and we do have our clients, or when we're pitching to clients, many of them do reference D365 as a potential solution for them, because a lot of them are already using Microsoft Suite applications, so they think it would be a seamless component with a D365 ERP. But it's a big monster as well. D365, it can cover quite a lot of functionalities and a wide breadth of processes. But now, depending on your size of the organization, is D365 really what you require? Because you might be ending up paying a lot, but not be utilizing that full suite of functionality. And that's why going through those operating principles, defining what exactly the modules that you require and what kind of information connectivity that you require, then you can start also looking at possible other, maybe less expensive solutions or less unknown solutions that can cover, and satisfy your operating principles.
Absolutely. And everyone here, please stay tuned for Wayne's keynote after this. He is actually talking about software selection and vendors in greater detail. So definitely stay tuned for that. The question I want to end with here before we take a quick break and come back is Roberto asked you specifically if you could explain more in the BI in your process, or the business intelligence, rather than just a part of the system. So I think he's asking you to just elaborate on business intelligence in general, maybe not just in the granular system activation. Does that make sense?
Well, it all depends on the operating principles that come out of this exercise. The example that I provided with case number 3, where the manufacturer has outgrown their current ERP, and part of the functional architecture is having a business intelligence, because in their operating principles, I think we've developed over almost 50 operating principles with this client, and out of the 50, 10 operating principles were focused on scenario modeling, or scenario modeling and building algorithms to find the right scenarios, or find the most optimal options. And therefore, so in their respect, they had a big need. They had a clear requirement for a business in a robust business intelligence module in order to cover the entire breadth of functional modules that are required in the ERP. If in other circumstances, where during the operating model exercises, where there wasn't much of a need to develop, scenario modeling and then build analytics in their operating model, then we would refer back to just maybe using the reporting system and the BI functionalities that are already embedded in that ERP solution.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for this great presentation. I think this is one of the unique topics that we haven't covered in all of our Digital Stratosphere events. It was really great to have you, Dean. We so appreciate your insight. If you could you please give your contact information in the chat, just in case all of these great questions that people have for you, they're able to reach out. You can also connect with Dean on LinkedIn as well, and see some more of his excellent ground control episodes, which is our long form podcast that you can find on any podcast platform. He did some great content for us. We also have him on our Digital Stratosphere podcast, which is our shorter form podcast that comes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. He did a state of the ERP industry in APAC just a few weeks ago. So if you'd like to hear more from Dean, head over to our YouTube channel, or you can check out our podcast. But thank you so much again, Dean. We so appreciate you being here today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kyler.
Absolutely. So we're going to take a quick 3-minute break before we get Wayne on stage. So just a reminder for our speakers, you're going to want to keep your window open. You just need to close your camera and mute your mic, and then we'll get Wayne going here in just a few minutes. If you do have questions specifically about software selection, which we know is a really hot topic within this region, please go ahead and put those questions in either the question and the answer field, or you can put them directly in the chat. Wayne has a wealth of knowledge. He's one of our most experienced leaders here at Third Stage, and will have a lot of great insight when it comes to this brand or system-specific dialogue. So thank you so much for all your engagement. It's really, really fun to watch, and we look forward to addressing it. Again, 3-minute break, and we'll be back in just a few. Welcome back, everyone, to our Digital Stratosphere event. You can't hear my timer in the background. I'm very punctual, so we're back on track to feature Wayne here for some software selection and strategy information. Just a few reminders as far as logistics. We love the dialogue going on in the comments, so keep that up. For sure, you can put it in the questions and the answers if you do have a question that you'd like Wayne to address, or continue that great commentary in the comment. I am putting our 2023 transformation report. This is our yearly report that we come out with insights and case studies, all of our top 10 lists. It's a 54-page report. It's basically all of our best thought leadership and findings from our client work in our new report. So actually, you are the first to get our 2023 report. It's being released this week, so we are giving you a sneak peek. So feel free to click on the link that I just put there in the chat, and you can download this amazing piece of thought leadership and a playbook really for your digital transformation. With that, I am excited to invite Wayne to the stage here. So Wayne is going to cover software selection, and he is the head of our APAC office. So we have, the full expert. Real quick, Wayne, so we don't get that echo. We can kind of talk about the different things that Wayne will feature, and then I'll let him do an intro. Again, when we talk about software selection, obviously we had some great insight from our audience here about really needing to meet the needs of an organization and kind of understand the perception that a lot of maybe these bigger vendors can come in with a very shiny, sparkly system that might not meet the full needs of the business. So I know I'm really excited to hear from Wayne, as he's been through countless software selections, specifically in leading our APAC region. So with that, I'll turn it over to Wayne. Feel free to pop any questions in the comments, and I can jump in and address those with Wayne during his presentation. So with that, welcome, Wayne.
Hi everyone, great to be here. It's good to be at the first third stage Stratosphere down here in the APAC region. Like Dean, I remember 2 or 3 years ago going to the US-based third stage Stratosphere, and so it was really good at that time to be a participant, and now it's good to be here as a presenter. And so and I've noticed in the chat there's been some really good dialogue going on about all the brand names of software and what software is the best, and how much software in the APAC region is SAP or it's Oracle or it's Microsoft, and it's interesting because SAP does have a big hold when we talk about the APAC region, and that's just been built over time. And I think if you think about how many times do we actually implement, how many times do organisations actually update, renew their ERP? And so I suppose the one thing that seemed to come out of all of the discussions we've had is that there is an expectation that when a company goes to a software provider, that they would know really what they want or what they need as such. And that's not often the case. Many times they expect that the software provider or solution integrator would actually give them the information they need to actually select the right software. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen, and I suppose as we've learnt over time, there are times when things go wrong, the wheels fall off, time blows out, cost blows out, and so these are all things that we'll be talking about in software selection. And and what Dean and Eric have both talked about is actually setting up that foundation. It's about putting you in the driver's seat as an organisation, not relying on someone to tell you something that you probably don't fully understand, but there's no one really to interpret what that means. And I think that's the big point that we see often when we're working with clients, is that when they come to it, they look at all those symptoms they have and they think, well, we just put a new software in and that will fix everything. And that is the least thing that actually they can actually do to achieve that, because if they don't know what they want, they don't have an understanding of what it should look like, then how will they ever know whether it's a good solution that's been deployed? So just let me share my screen, just make sure this comes up. And so we want window. Bring this up. Oh, I know what I'll do. I'll do this way, and we will share the screen, and I'll bring up my PowerPoint. So here we go. There we go. So can everybody see my screen? Hopefully you can, because I can't see you. So we will continue with the presentation, and
we can see it, Wayne. It looks great.
Perfect. Oh, that's great. It's good to know that technology can fail when you don't want it to, and on this occasion it hasn't. So that's a good step. So I suppose tonight is about determining about software selection, but a little bit about me. I've been around, I suppose, in consulting game for digital for a number of years. I've deployed and I've worked a lot in large scale deployments. I've also worked where organisations are looking to grow their business, had a world of business coaching, and so my background is fairly diverse when it comes to software, digital transformation, change management, training, all of those sort of aspects that go into a digital transformation. And so software selection is a key part to that, and many times we start doing software selection before we should start to do software selection. And so it's interesting that many organisations are just looking, as I mentioned, into the chat there, where people, organisations, they go to the software vendor, or they look on maybe Eric's, every year he puts out a top 10 and looks at that and says, well, that's the top 10 in the world, so we may as well go for one of those. But not really understanding that top 10 is based on an overall perspective, and it does point that some of the functionality within the various platforms, when they come out of the box, is better than others. And I think that's a key point, is that when we look at these evaluations, we actually look at what is out of the box as such. What's the functionality that it comes with? Not what can we customize it to actually make it be something that probably it was never ever thought to be. And in the previous world, and why SAP is probably as entrenched as it has been, is because a big part of their model was that if we customized it to whatever the customer needed, then we would have a lifelong customer, because that customer, to shift and to change was going to be difficult. We had something which was unique to them, and we had them believe that uniqueness was very important. And so software selection became a brand buying exercise, because all of a sudden I looked at the brand, I said, well, it must be good, and so that's what I would buy. Today we're actually starting to look at the differences of owning software. What's it cost to operate the software? How functional is it? How well do we actually use that software? So that's a key thing we're going to look at. The next part is the risks. So what are those risks that we have when we're selecting software? And there are a number of risks, and Dean touched on a couple of them, in the sense that, we could be sold much more software than we need, and so we end up with shelfware. Or we could actually go down a pathway where we start to say, well, the software that we've got isn't the best we have, so we'll put up best of breed model. And so when you start going best of breed, all of a sudden I'm having multiple different licensing aspects or relationships with different vendors. I have to then connect and integrate that software. So there's risks with that. And then selecting the right software. Are all softwares equal? And you'll see when we go through this exercise, no, they're not. And they aren't equal even on the basis of the modules that sit within the software. And so we'll talk about that. And then the last thing is, if we're going to spend money on software, and we're going to disrupt our business to the point where change management is, if it's not done well, it can cripple our business and cripple the way that we supply, or cripple the way that we pay people, or cripple the way that things happen within our organisation, which actually takes value away, then we need to make sure that we're very, very clear on what it is, the value we're looking to realise. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. There's three main ways that organisations select software, and so they often go out and they'll either search the net or whatever, and everything on the net is true, obviously, and so they'll seek out a software vendor or a brand, or a solution integrator might have an article on there, and so that might be their way forward in actually selecting their software, and they sort of get a bit of buy-in based on what they see, and they might recognise a few of their problems that they have. And as Dean mentioned, organisations have it where they see the symptoms, they see the pain points, and the software vendor and the solution integrator are very, very well tuned at picking up on those and actually making those the reason you're actually going to do this, or how we're going to solve that problem. Very rarely do they actually point out the fact that it really might be actually a root cause. It might be a process issue. It might be the fact that we've actually got very poor infrastructure that actually supports our applications of our software. And so some of those things are never considered. And so we go and buy a user experience as such, and then we find that, that user experience doesn't do what we want it to do. So as we get into the project, we find we might need to customize, and we might need to shift, and we might need to change. And I think I saw a question there from Purity a little bit earlier. Organizations that are deploying software find that often that things go wrong, in the sense that the timelines start to get expanded. All of a sudden we need to do some customizations because what we were thinking we wanted isn't really delivered in the solution. So let's do a few customizations to actually make it fit what we need. And so that's where usually it blows out. And the reason we're doing that is we're doing that after we've actually started the ball rolling. We've actually set clicked the starting gun, and the software vendor and the solution integrator off and running, and on go those charges. And so when things change, the charges just continue to happen. And so there are some of the things that we find if we just go to the software vendor first, or the solution integrator. And a critical thing when we talk about solution integrators and software is the sense that, in many of the top tier organizations, they have associations with many of the software vendors. And so if you go to, there's probably half a dozen of large scale solution integrators that might have a practice in Microsoft, SAP, Oracle. It depends on which partner you actually talk to. So if you talk to the partner that actually heads up the Microsoft team, then they'll be saying that Microsoft is the best one. Does that mean it's the best? Or does that mean that's just what they're selling? And that's the thing we need to be careful of when we actually start looking at selecting software, is what is it that we actually want? And that's where we can drive that conversation as against, what are you going to sell me? And you're only selling me that because that's all you have to sell. If I was to talk to another provider or another partner within that organization, they may say, SAP is the best. You can't go past SAP. It's the greatest. And so are we getting the best information that suits our organization or suits our needs? Another one, and we see this often now because, if you look at new technologies and the way technology has evolved, in the sense that we have now cloud, we have all of those sort of different types of platforms. So where we used to have an on-premise type solution, software solution, and that would stay around with us for 10 to 15 years. Now we actually have the model where, and we didn't make any changes to that software. We might have, a few upgrades here and there, but mainly we had someone come in and add some customizations or improve it from that perspective. The new model is actually saying, well, we want to have version control. So software vendors actually want to have where, they are constantly updating, because they can actually maintain that software at a cheaper cost than they have where something goes well out of date, and then they try and keep putting out new upgrades, and those upgrades don't work, and so there's the cost of trying to maintain that software. And so that's where the model has changed significantly. And so what you find now is that as people start looking around, they'll ask another organisation who may have just been through a deployment, and they'll say, well, what did you do? How did you get success? And it's just very interesting. We've worked with 2 clients on sales calls this week, and talking to them, and it's interesting how both of them have actually spoken to other organisations, and when they come to us, they say, well, this other organisation put in this software solution, and so we need that to be on the top of our list. You go, but your business you're an importer, and that company's a manufacturer. Can you say that they should be the ones that you should have? And so that's often the discussion that we have when you start looking at other organisations, and even other organisations that are similar in nature. They might both be manufacturers, they might both be retailers. Does it mean that they should have exactly the same software to suit their needs? Because structurally they may be different. You know, the way they operate may be different. And so by just putting technology in and saying this technology is best of breed, then is that the right way for us to go when we talk about software selection? Because best of breed is one of those things that says, yes, I have the best software for you to have, and the processes that sit within the software that enable the software are the best we could have built. Are they the best for your business? Do they provide competitive advantage over other organisations in your same market? No, they don't. But you know, we get lost in this terminology, and jargon and terminology is a real challenge for organisations that are starting to look at software and new software, because you know there's often terms that are used that are misleading and they aren't really clearly articulated, and so that's a big challenge for organisations embarking on this journey. And the third one that's often happening these days is this software selection process. And clients that come to us have the view that they want to do an independent selection process. But the risk they have is if they talk to some organisations, they might find that there is an association to a particular software vendor. So they really fall back up into that number one type category there, instead of get to that thing and say, what do we really want? How is our business operating? And so what Dean sort of talked about a little bit earlier there was that, you know, organisations now say, well, our context may have changed, our business model may have changed, and if you look at any organisation in the last 2 years, things have changed. We cannot deny that. And how do we get efficiency back into our organisations? If you look at supply chain management, it's probably one of the most disrupted things across the globe. And so how do we reset that and get that efficiency back into what we want to be able to do? Is it buying a brand that's reputable? I doubt it. Is it understanding what you need as an organisation to actually drive how you operate, what's the best way for you to operate? Then they are the sort of things that you need to consider. So carry out that software selection process also needs to incorporate requirements. So what are my requirements? And down to a level of detail where you can really identify. So am I a multinational? Do I go cross geographies? So do I need different currency? Do I need multi-entity? All of those sort of things might be things that I need to consider that will identify a more suitable software solution than just a brand or just what my friend down the road who runs an organisation has. So these are key things to think about when we actually are looking at software. Software is not the solution. Software is an enabler to support a solution, and I think that's a distinction that is coming out more and more, is that people are starting to see, and especially the ones that have gone down the road and have had those fails and, you know, working on some expert witness type engagements, you soon start to see what we started out with, and that, you know, those rose-coloured glasses where if we bought a solution, it would just go like clockwork, we'd implement it, everything would work well. And then we realised that it didn't, and the time's blown out and the cost has gone out, and the solution integrator's saying, well, you need to pay me, or the software vendor's saying, well, I've sold you these licenses and you need to use them, but you really haven't got any value out of it. And so these are things that we need to consider when we actually are talking about software. And so the risks, and these often aren't visible, and we can't see these right from the start. And so, but a key thing when we talk to a software vendor is that if we look at their model, the sales model they have is to sell you as much software as they can, because the bigger the number for them, the more commission the salesman gets. And that might sound cynical, but if you look at the larger brands, they have a whole marketing and sales team. They aren't the technical people. The technical people sit in the back room and, you know, probably rock back and forward. But when you start looking at the sales mechanism that goes on, they know they have these abilities to be able to identify where your pain points are and then sell to those perceived weaknesses that you have and how good their software is. And they usually sell it at a level that gives you that feeling that they're going to be able to look at all the processes and they're going to have a lot of detail because they've got best practice processes. But when you look at some of those processes, you find they're very high level. They're not really at a level that you actually, how you actually operate. And that's a key thing. And so when we start looking at that risk that's there, we end up where we've got lots and lots of modules that don't really work together very well. And then we find that, oh, geez, we need some complexity. We need APIs and we need customization and we need interfaces. And so that's where we start getting, partially used modules. So we've got a module sitting here, we'll use 5% of it. And so you go, well, but I've paid, that's part of, you've added that into my bill of materials. So I've got this shelfware that I can't use I have to park over here, but I use a very small portion of it. And so that's a real risk, because if you think of the life of the software, you don't have a software in an ERP or a HCM module or a CRM for 1 year. You have it for many years. And it's not until you upgrade do you actually change that relationship. And so that shelfware you're paying for forever until you decide to change. The next one, solution integrators take high-level view to win the sale. So the aim is to be able to try and take the risk out of what happens with the digital transformation. And there's two ways that you can actually embark on a digital transformation. One is you can take the really detailed way and be very, very, very intricate with everything that's done, and take a really conservative view, and what the estimates might be. You might actually add some more in because it's going to take a bit longer. Or you take that other side where you go, well, no, I'm going to employ an integrator and they'll just take the pain out of it. And we'll be fine. We don't really need to worry too much. And so the complexity is created when you're trying to deploy, because all of a sudden that high level view says, this is all good, this is what we can deliver. But when we actually start talking to the business stakeholders and the people who actually operate those processes, and we find that those processes aren't all done the same way, we find then that there's the devil is in the detail. And so that's where those costs start blowing out. And Purity, as you talked about earlier, it's about those things where customizations creep in just to cover those blind spots that we actually had, or we need an extra piece of an interface to actually bring information in that couldn't actually be brought in before. So these are things that are important for us to be able to make sure that we have it at a right level of detail, but we also have, and I always look at it, it's that line of sight and the operating principles that Dean mentioned. When you actually create that vision, all of a sudden it's much easier to be able to watch what's happening and be able to bring the solution integrator back to the table and sort of say, well, this was our premise of purchasing this. And so this objective is what we had very clearly articulated. And so all of a sudden it's, and when they're relatable and they're present tense, all of a sudden you can visualize them. Even though they might not yet be delivered and deployed, you can visualize what they're going to look like and how they're actually going to roll out in the business. And so it allows you to be able to be much, much closer to what you actually need, as against be told, oh, we can't do that, or we never thought about that, or you never told us about that at the start. And so these are things that are very important for us to be able to keep top of mind as we go. The other one, software is seen as the problem solver. How many software solutions do you hear of that say, if you put in technology, all of your problems will be fixed? But as we know that our organisations aren't just built up of technology, they're actually built up of processes. We have people, and heaven forbid, people have to use these systems, and we have to train people. We have to, a key thing for change management is people understanding the why. Why are we doing this? Why have we changed this? Why does that technology make us do it this way? Because it seems the long way around. And that's some of those areas where technology process may be best of breed. But when you start looking at it, you say, well, sometimes it's quite clunky, and it's not the best way to go, because all of a sudden we don't have that level of complexity in our business. So have we got the right software anymore? Should have we selected that software? And so these are things that are very important when we are selecting software. How does our organisation operate? Are we very rigid? Are we very flexible? Each software has a different tendency on where it focuses on. If you come from the SAP world, it is that very, very rigid, data heavy, needs lots of information. There's a piece of paper or a transaction for everything. Whereas some others might not. They're much more flexible and much more easy to be able to have those workflows go through across different organisations, which can be a pain because if you're trying to get consistency and a robust way of doing things, then that can be a problem as well. So it's really understanding what you need as an organisation. Having customizations, one of the biggest challenges with customizations for organizations in this current environment is the fact that cost of ownership. So if I've got high customizations, I need someone who's going to constantly be in there supporting. They know my solution because they've actually built it. I don't know my solution. I only know how it works. And so I need someone in constantly. Every time I make a change, every time something goes wrong, I need someone I've got to pay to actually come in and help me with that. Whereas if I had a standard out of the box, then I've got a software vendor who goes, well, that hasn't happened for any of the other clients that we have. Let's have a look at that. It might be your instance. We can actually target what that is. And you get a lot more support from your software vendor. Whereas if you've got other customizations, you have to go to your solution integrator to be able to get that. And there's ongoing maintenance costs and there's ongoing support. And one of the big challenges when we talk about SAP in this modern era is the fact that if we do a lot of customizations with an SAP and we have this versioning where every 2 to 3 years we're actually upgrading the version that we actually have, then we're almost like going mini deployments every 2 or 3 years. And whereas in the past, we've worked with clients where in the last 20 years they've had, 1 or 2 versions of SAP over that time. They might do a few version upgrades or enhancement packs, but not a lot of change. So it stays relatively the same and they can sort of keep it as it is. But that world is changing. And this ongoing version control is a big thing for software vendors to actually focus on. And as Dean mentioned, the high level of workarounds. And so what you find and this often happens when we don't have technology or we don't have change management and people involved with that change management and the technology implementation, because what you find is that the technology has its own set of technology-based processes, but the rest of the organisation has its way of operating. And so whether we've got Excel spreadsheets bringing things together or we've got all of those other sort of workarounds that we have, then what we find is that we've got this mismatch, and we can actually go backwards in our performance. We have a lot of disruption until we actually settle back, and those workarounds that we've had before that weren't broken start to hold everything together, and we rely on those certain people within the organisation who just hold all those strings together. That shouldn't be how it is, because once they leave, then how do we then get over that? We then need to either create more workarounds to actually make a new set of ways to work, or we stand on the basis that the solution has really good process knowledge and really good understanding of how the organisation works, and that's what we're looking for. So that's how you overcome those risks. So,
and Wayne, real quick.
Yeah.
We have a really interesting comment from Jonathan. I need to hear a little bit of an echo from me, but I'm going to read it. So he basically said it's a vicious cycle. The C-suite execs also don't want to take the risk of using an ungranted system, but it might not be what's best for the organization, leading to failure. And I wanted to get your feedback on that comment from Jonathan.
It's interesting because sometimes I won't say they're unbranded, but sometimes they're in-house. You have organisations that have in-house solutions that they've built over time, or you might have ones that are lesser known brands. It's often the reason we put technology in is we see that as the solution to our problem, whereas many times we aren't using the software that we already have properly, and so sometimes re-looking at how we actually use that technology can actually be a better step than actually going and saying, well, let's just go out and put a new software in and not consider how we actually use it or how we operate it. So hopefully that answers the question, because it's one of those areas that many times we see a new software get put in, and because the business hadn't changed in any way, that new software suffers the same problems in a very short time as the previous software did, because there wasn't diligence, there wasn't focus on how we actually operate, and people had a lot of that inconsistency in the way they managed things, the way they managed data, and that was a problem.
Absolutely. And there was a few more questions and dialogue around customization. So much so of what level of customization would you recommend? And because of those certain processes that need to be incorporated, where do you kind of draw the line? We're not all of the click for customization.
It's an interesting question, and thanks for asking that, because for my view, and having been around where organisations have customised heavily over the years, and I've looked at the validity of that customisation, and I find that, you know, as a business owner, the customisation they have is really narrow focused. It doesn't add efficiency. It doesn't add the ability to be able to remove complexity. It just adds this area that the business feels as if we're special in the way that we do it. And there's many areas of a business that aren't special. So if we talk about processing invoices, we talk about those sorts of things. If we have a special, unique way where we have, 50 people have to sign it off before we actually get to pay the account and those sorts of things, and that's exaggerating, but if we have those sort of processes, and they do happen in organisations, then what we find is that we're adding complexity and customizations for the sake of it. The difficulty in that in the modern era is the fact that for us to be able to put in, machine learning and artificial intelligence, the problem we're looking for, the problem that they solve, is they're looking for consistent trends so that they can actually model that behaviour. If we don't have that, and we are quite unique in the way we do things, then getting consistency is quite difficult. And so your ability to be able to put in AI solutions and those sort of things is much, much harder. And so for me, in today's modern era, my thought is customization should be the least thing that you look at. Configuration is that thing that says, well, we'd like it to look like this, or it work this sort of way, or bring this sort of functionality into it. So we configure the solution. We don't customize the solution, because customization actually changes the functionality to a way that it is different than what the solution provider had built into the solution. So we're actually saying, well, we know a better way. We're going to make it our way. And I think that's the challenge or that's what software salespeople have had the benefit of selling in the past, is that ability to say, well, we'll make it unique for you, knowing that you are tied to them forever. And so whereas when you start looking at it, I've seen organizations that have the configuration mindset, and they actually have versioning come out, and they never need to go back and do regression testing and those sorts of things, because already the solution and the update's being tested when it gets pushed out. It's just like Microsoft sends out a new version of Word or Excel, or Apple sends out a new version of their tool. There's very minimal bugs that actually come out in those, and so that's the benefit of having a really trusted solution you've actually got, not covering it with customizations that the risk is you're going to break something that you didn't know about. And so I think that's one of the big challenges about customization. For my thought, minimal customization if you can.
Excellent. Well, keep those questions coming. I know we have some regional dialogue and for homework for Wayne, for him to address here. We'll keep going with this great presentation, Wayne. Thank you so much for this insight.
No worries. And so if we start looking about from an independent perspective about software evaluation, it's not racing to the brand. It's not racing to a particular solution. It's saying, what's my requirements? What do I actually need from this software? And then one of the probably the most underestimated aspects of this is demonstrate your requirements. And so when I say to a software vendor, if I provide them a script of what I want to see from this software, and they can demonstrate that back to me, that is much better than them showing, look how great this is. I've got this solution here. I can show you how fantastic it looks, but it never gets to the level of detail that a user might actually integrate with the system. It really has everything that just so seamless. It all just works like clockwork. Never does it actually roll out that way, because many times you find that, they've got interfaces built in the background, they've got data sets, they've got it running so finely tuned that you as an organization, if you tried to deploy it to that, then that would be a challenge, because there's a lot of extra inclusions that aren't out of the box inclusions, and that's what challenging. That's why we say demonstrate based on scripts that you want to see when we talk about software solution. The other thing is a value comparison. So, it's not about saying, well, SAP's got to be the best because, it's got the best marketing, the best brand, and, Oracle's actually on one of the Formula One cars, so, I should pick that one because that'd be great. It's about saying, what's the value for my organisation? If it's going to be a very, very high total cost of ownership and I don't get the value out of it, I need other solutions in to actually make the solution work for me, then I need to consider that. So, do I need a Rolls Royce when I really only need a Mini Minor type car to get me from A to B? That works very, very well. It's efficient. You turn the key every time and it starts. As against something that, I've got sitting in there, and by the time I've got it started and I've manoeuvred it around, it's cost me a lot of money. The suitability comparison is another one, in the sense that when we talk about suitability, my organisation has certain needs and certain requirements in the way we operate. It's my competitive advantage. Technology is built on the basis, and the modern technology is built on the basis of everything suits. So we've got SaaS models, so software as a subscription. That's the cloud type stuff. We don't want to have customizations in that, or vendors don't want to have customizations, so they want everybody to use the solution exactly the same way. But that's the difference, is what could it be configured to suit what we need and not necessarily customized to suit what we need. And I think that's one of that suitability comparisons that we need to be able to look at. And the cost of ownership comparison. So, have we got a very complex solution that actually has lots of other things needed, APIs and extra databases and all of those sorts of things that we might need, high-speed connection lines, all those other things that are addition to what we're buying as an application. And so when we start looking at it, we need to look at it as a holistic solution, not just I bought the application, I bought the licenses, or I bought the subscription. Oh, there's all of these other things I need now to actually interact with any of the other systems I have, or be able to get to my data or retrieve my data and do those sorts of things. And so these are the sort of things that you look at when you're looking at a total software evaluation. This is an example that gives you a bit of a view, and so that might look quite complex. So I'll just draw your eye to the middle. So if we look at the middle, this is just a discrete manufacturing analysis. And so what we've got here is we've got was it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different software solutions there. So each one of those cylinders in the middle there represents a different software, and one of those is Oracle, one of them is SAP. And so you can see here that as we start, there's a Microsoft one in here, and so you can start to see that, if I look at each of these for a particular area or a different type of business, so this is discrete manufacturing, they make things you can count. So it's not complex manufacturing, it's just discrete manufacturing. You can see the suitability across all of the modules. So each one of the ERP solutions has financial management, has inventory management, has manufacturing management, purchasing management, sales management, quality management, human resources, and there is a technology platform. So that could actually be, whether it's suitable for mobility or suitable for, cloud or those sorts of things. So that's what that's looking at. So you can see here that, there's a fair bit of comparison between these. But when I start looking at it from a module level, so for financial management, you can start to see that there are some there that are more superior than others. And then as I move around, and these are all exactly the same solutions, so they're all the same brands as the colours stand out there, you can see that they've moved. So where one in inventory management, the light blue or the teal blue, is the second, in the financial management, it's number 5. And in manufacturing management, it's number 7. And so you start going, well, when I'm looking at my solution, I need to start to consider it more than just the ERP overall. What requirements do I have from this? And so I might find that I've selected that I have a multi-entity organization where I have multi-currency. We've got distribution centers scattered all over the APAC region. So my financial management needs to be able to support that as much as my inventory management, as much as my purchasing management. And so that's where I start to say, well, how do these work together for me to be able to get an effective outcome? And so this is the critical piece that often is overlooked when we talk about requirements. What's important to me? It may be that I have HR isn't so important because, I have another module that bolts on. I might have as in this case here, I might have a success factors that I use as well for in a SAP world, and don't use the standard HCM module. So for me, it might be that, it's okay if my human resources are low because I've actually got maybe a best of breed model. But these are the sort of things that helps you analyze what you really, really want as a solution. And so when we started to get these operating principles, and we start to get these underlying processes that drive it, and as Dean talked about, that functional architecture that actually sits with it, no longer is it valid for us to be able to look at the overall module comparison and say, I'm just going to pick that one because look, that one's got, if I look at the purple one there, it's 97.86. So there's only a couple of other areas that it actually is number 1. So is it the right one for me? In sales management, it's actually back at number 4. And so these are things that I think that when we talk about software selection, understanding about software as it sits in the modern world. And so, technology, as we've talked about in the SAP world, it may have been around for a long time. Oracle, a lot of those on-premise solutions that many have and are changing out of now were the way in the past where we had one solution and that was it. And we had the modules and we sort of customized them to make them work the way we wanted. Now what we want to be able to say is, of these modules, how can we get them to work to suit what our type of business is? And that may mean that we're choosing a different software, not just one software fits all scenario. The benefits of effective software selection. And so it's important that we consider this and talk about this because, the solution itself should act as a baseline for process improvement and alignment for every year, every day after you've gone live. And so the problem shouldn't be that you're actually fixing problems or gaps within the solution. It's about improving. It's about getting better value out of what you do and improving from a perspective of how do we get better market share? How do we communicate with our customers? How do we supply more on time to our customers? That's process improvement because that's actually functional process improvement, not how should I be fixing the software because all of a sudden it doesn't deliver what we want. We can't actually see some of these problems happening. And so that's the difference I talk about, is a good solution should act as a baseline, a foundation for that ongoing process improvement, the way you operate, and the way you actually get value back to your customers. It supports reportability of end-to-end process effectiveness. And so one of these things of how do I actually know that the processes that people are doing and using every day are actually effective? Because over time, right becomes wrong. And so what we did once before may no longer be effective anymore. And so, the ways we target markets, the way we actually, our sales and marketing plans may not be hitting the target anymore. Things may have changed. And so how would we actually know that that's the case? So if we have reportability, we have the understanding of what we can see about how well our processes are working, but also then how's our performance going, then all of a sudden we have the ability to continue to improve that business. And technology is that enabler for us. And I can't underestimate that statement, is the fact that technology should be the enabler for the way we operate as against be the thing that we operate around as such. And I think that's a difference. Another important one is we're going to spend thousands, hundreds of thousands. I know of an organisation at the moment that is in the multi-millions of dollars, and some big, large SAP and Oracle type deployments can be, and global employments can be, billions of dollars as such. When they're finally deployed across a global organisation, do they get that back, or is it just a cost, a sunk cost? Ideally, when we actually are deploying software, we should be looking at efficiency improvements. And that's usually the business case actually is built on efficiency. It's about improvements, how we're going to pay for this. But no one, once we get to go live, I know the solution integrator is usually very rarely interested in wanting to be able to show value return after go live, because they've usually left the building by that time. It's not until they want a next upgrade or do a re-implementation do you actually see them back again. So value is something that the business needs to make sure that it's looking at and making sure that it can see. And those operating principles that Dean talked about, that's defining the way we want to operate, which should actually have an underpinning aspect to it of value. And so that's a really important thing for organisations to consider, that we aren't just buying a software solution, we're actually looking for something that's going to return value back to our organisation. And finally, we have a robust platform for growth. And organisations in across the globe are constantly looking to grow. If we are actually going backwards, then that's a real challenge for organisations to actually stay liquid, stay delivering their service to their customers. So the aim is that we're actually putting in something that will actually enable us to be able to have growth and support that growth if we are looking to be able to get efficiency out of the solution that we put in. So I've talked a bit about software solution there. As you can see, it's not just a simple exercise in my mind. It's one of those things that it's almost a paradigm shift. Do we go customization? Do we go config? Should we buy a brand? Should we not? All of these questions become on the table, as against going to do a Google search and finding the top 3 or 4 software solution providers, and then going, well, I'll choose one of those because I like the colours on their brand. And that might sound a bit cynical, but it's interesting. I worked with an organisation 2 years ago, and we said to them, why did you choose this particular product? And they said, so one other person in the team actually had worked with that before, so we just thought that would be a good one. No real explanation, no real view on value, no real view on being able to get improvement out of it, and was it the right fit for their organisation? Didn't even consider that. So these are things that are important for you to consider when we're actually looking at software solutioning, and it's also that thing of understanding, what we need to do first. How do we want to operate? What's changed in our world? And then buy a software that actually suits that, with a bit of thinking that goes behind that. So, Kyla, is there any other questions that have come through?
Yes. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I was off mute. It's 4:30 in the morning here, so give me a break.
Coffee.
I know, right? All the coffee. So we had some dialogue that I'm interested to get back on. And it's around employee motivation. When it comes to things like user adoption and the maximizing value of any selection or implementation that you might undergo as an organization, what would you say to executives that are incredibly motivated, but it doesn't transition down to the front line?
It's interesting because I usually find that most people want to be part of a dream, or want to be part of something that's actually looks like it's going to be very good. So communication is a huge part to that, and actually sharing with the organisation or the stakeholders that down at that front line the why, because many people get focused on I do it this way and I've always done it that way. I hate change. I don't want to change. But if they understand that there is a better way and it would actually save them some time, we had one organisation where their end of month would go 5 days into the next month. And so when we actually started to look at it, and we said, well, if we improve this, we could actually do end of month close on the same day. It was like, oh, thank goodness. I am sick of wasting all that time with my family because I have to work weekends to do this. And so these are the sort of things where it's about sharing with the people what the benefits are and communicating that and really working hard on achieving that. And usually you find they are front and centre wanting to be part of that and being engaged in that.
Absolutely. And Wayne, if you wouldn't mind just muting your mic while I ask you some questions. Because I have some follow-up questions that I just want to wrap up, and I'm hoping that you can help us answer. And there's just a weird echo there. So when it comes to a few of our questions that we had in our question and answer queue, a few of them were about open code. So one of them I'm going to ask you is infrastructure as code is a commonplace and provides standardization through automation. Are you seeing signs of compliance as code in heavily regulated industries where regulations change from country to country? Can you address that?
Yeah, you do see where, especially cross organisation, and there's certain areas of certain rules that organisations have to work to. So, open code type systems struggle in those environments because you're trying to look at and meet that compliance. And so it wouldn't help if you actually went out and bought a solution that didn't accommodate that requirement.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. And another question we had kind of along those lines on the technical side, and it's in terms of effort and patience regarding UAT. Have you noticed in your customers an attitude of they will fix it for us? I don't have time to bother with testing. They meaning the consultant. Is that something that you've seen within your career?
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's often you see that, and or the other problem is that they see it. They get UAT right at the end, and that's where all the defects come out. And so, the users actually go, well, this is not how I expected it to be. So this is a number one defect, and so then you've got that challenge where we're going to deploy this, and whether you like it or whether you don't, it's going to be deployed. And so you get both aspects there. One where you just fix it, it's fine. Or you said it would be right, and I expect that's the case. Or you get the other side where it's not right, and this can't go live, and soon they get overridden, and you get a lot of then that disharmony that actually people have with the solution, and the engagement after go live is quite poor.
Definitely. I think that's a great piece to just really understand in that testing phase. And a lot of that goes back to kind of our greater thesis of this conversation around that phase zero strategy, and just making sure that we're setting expectations on not only the client side, but on the deliverable side when it comes to that process piece. So the last question I'll end with here that's in our question and answer one is again on that kind of no code application lines. Are you seeing more, no code applications or low code applications make their way into digital transformation? I know we've seen that a lot on kind of the industry trend sides that Eric and I talk about on our Grand Control podcast. But I wondered if you could give us more of a regional specific lens to the saturation or the emergence of those no-code applications.
It's interesting because we'll talk about Microsoft. Microsoft have got a couple of solutions, and one of them is heavily based on no code. So Business Central actually has that. And if you talk to some people, they say, well, it's clunky, it's awful. We don't like those no code apps that we have to have. But if you talk to people that are actually used to it, they find that the benefit is massive in the sense that they can actually build an application that actually suits their needs. And so that no code as it sits in with, like the Microsoft suite of options there, and there's a number of others that have it as well. it really adds a lot of advantage, and the benefit is the upgradability, the cost of ownership is much, much lower. And so to me, it's a big shift. And I think that in the next 5 years, we'll see a lot of low code, no code type applications supporting ERP applications.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we've been looking at as far as our software solutions. And a lot of times that can be a really interesting conversation with clients, right? Because that might sound really good, but they might not always have either the IT infrastructure, the capabilities as skill sets internally, those types of things. So I know a lot of our consultants globally, sometimes when they hear a client wants a no-code application, they can kind of say, oh, like cringe a little bit just because they're not sure that that's always the best solution. And as you said, that's kind of where the industry might be heading. But a lot of times we find with those emerging technologies that might not be what the business needs today to create, that maximize value from their system. But this has been such a great and really relevant keynote today, Wayne. So thank you so much for your time. And we so appreciate it. If you don't mind, could you pop your contact information in the chat? You can also connect with Wayne on our LinkedIn. He's also a main contributor to our podcast, which I put links to below. You can see him on there. He's also on our YouTube pages and actually owns more of our long form workshops, which I put a link in the chat to our YouTube page as well. Wayne covers things like the ARP operating model and establishing your target operating model. Also, process mining is his specialty. So he goes through a lot of how you leverage process mining within your digital transformation and overall business optimization. So I'd like to close with just thanking everyone so much for joining us, whether you are joining us live and engaging in this great dialogue, or you are watching it after the fact. You can always connect with us again on our YouTube channel. We do host live streams every Tuesday. They happen at 8 a.m. Typically here at Mountain Time, 10 a.m. in Eastern Time in the U.S., and we love to have this same sort of ongoing dialogue. So please feel free to join us. Again, Wayne is a main contributor, Dean as well, on those live streams. We cover additional topics. If you are still awake with us at 10 a.m. Eastern Time in the United States, we will have one today that actually features one of our directors from our Africa office to talk about the emerging role of the CIO. So if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you can set up a reminder for that. You can also join on Eric's LinkedIn page or my LinkedIn page as well. So with that, thank you so much. We'd always love to hear your feedback. So I will drop my email in the chat box as well. If you do have any follow-up questions, I'm happy to attach them to the most relevant stakeholder in that conversation, or just have questions about Third Stage in general, feel free to reach out to me. We will be hosting our EMEA Digital Stratosphere regional event in September. So stay tuned on Crowdcast. We will let you know through the Crowdcast feature here, and you can join our European and Africa and Middle East team as well that are some of Wayne counterparts. So thank you so much to our APAC team. Thank you for our audience, and we will see you next time.